The first Christian church ends up in Samaria. Now that's a surprise. I mean, can you imagine? You think of where, if you, okay, go back to the year 25 AD. Jesus hasn't been baptized yet. And you're sitting around and you're thinking, well, the Messiah's going to come here in a few years. And then there'll be followers and there'll be churches. And where's the first church going to be? And you would say, well, I guess depending. You'd probably say, well, Jerusalem. If you're a good Jewish boy, Jerusalem for sure. Or maybe one of the pious cities in Galilee, Capernaum or something, where there's a big synagogue. Maybe you can imagine Alexandria or Babylon where there was a huge Jewish population, but probably not. No, but I'll tell you the last place that you would say is that village in Samaria where Jacob's well is. I mean, that doesn't even make the top, it doesn't even make the list. And yet, that's what happens. This is John chapter 4. Hey, YouTube theologians, Pastor Wolfmueller here. Sunday drive home on a Wednesday, but who's counting? So Jesus, John chapter 4 was our text this Sunday. And Jesus is traveling down from Galilee to Jerusalem, and instead of going down by the Jordan, he goes through Samaria, and they get to the village, and they get to Jacob's well, and the disciples go in to get provision, and Jesus is there, and the woman comes to visit. And Jesus says, could you draw me some water? And now this conversation starts with the woman at the well, which is it's just amazing. Why are you talking to me? She says. Jesus says, look, if you knew who was talking to you, you would ask me for living water. How are you going to draw this? Are you greater than Jacob? Yes. Then go get your husband. And this is kind of funny because she says, well, I'm not married. And Jesus says, yeah, you're right. You're telling the truth. You've been married 5 times. And the man that you're with now, you're not married to. So you're right. You're not married. Oh. So the conscience, the activated conscience defers the question, right? Should we worship on the mountain? You say we should both worship in Jerusalem. Amazing. Just on that point, it's amazing to me how a troubled conscience becomes instantly a theological debater. A troubled conscience becomes a philosopher. A disputer of this age. That's how Paul says it. So Jesus has brought up the fact that she's breaking the 6th commandment, living in adultery after multiple divorces and so forth. And she wants to go to the worship question, the worship debate. Well, Jesus cuts right through it. The Messiah is coming, and Jesus says, the one, I'm him, I am. And she believes. Now, and then she goes back to, and she becomes an evangelist and leads the way for Jesus to come into the village, and then the whole village believes. They first believe what she said, and then they believe what Jesus said, and this whole Samaritan village becomes Christian. Before anything like that happens in any Jewish village, this Samaritan village, the first Christian church of Samaria. It's amazing to think of. Now, here's even something more amazing. So when you read through the Gospel of John, one of the themes that comes out very quickly is the idea of being a witness. Right at the beginning of John, with John the Baptist, I'm a witness of these things. I'm not the one. I'm a witness to the one that's coming. So John is a witness. John, the evangelist, the writer of the gospel, presents himself to us as a witness. The one who's seen these things testifies that they're true. And then, like this Sunday, we have John chapter 9, the blind man. It's like a court case, you know. The Pharisees are standing in judgment of the man, and we're your parents, and this is the really man born blind, and it's the scene, and the whole gospel is structured as a case, like witnesses are called to the stand to give their testimony about this man Jesus. And if you read the Gospel of John as a briefing in a court case, it starts to really make sense. And this is why it's so important that John says the things that we saw, we've told you. Which is why there's very few times in the Gospel of John where, like all the things that happened to Jesus where the disciples weren't there, John doesn't tell us about. Like the birth, the disciples weren't there. Or the temptation in the wilderness, the disciples weren't there. And these aren't in John. He's just bringing to us the things that he himself has seen. With two exceptions, maybe three, maybe four, maybe, but at two exceptions for sure. And that is the woman at the well and Mary Magdalene at the tomb. In other words, in John chapter 4, John calls as a witness to Jesus this Samaritan woman. Now this is, if you were making a case in the ancient world, this is not the person that you would call to testify. But the fact that John calls her to testify on behalf of Jesus and to give an account of the conversation that she had with Jesus is part of the Christian argument. That this woman who would be despised even by the Samaritans, I mean, she's there at midday. Pastor LeBlanc made this point in the sermon from his time in Africa when he was missionarying there, that the women would never go to the well in midday, and they would never go to the well by themselves. That is just a no-no. You always go in the morning or the evening, and you always go in a crowd for safety reasons, for not being scalding hot reasons. And yet here this woman is there at the well at the midday by herself. She's not just an outcast by being a Samaritan. She's an outcast of the Samaritans. She's not even considered by this man that she's with worthy of being married to. And yet she's called to testify on behalf of Jesus. And she is honored by this conversation with Jesus. And she is the one who sits with Jesus to hear these precious words first spoken. The love of Jesus for all people, all the way down to the bottom. Especially down at the bottom. Especially for the outcast. Especially for the guilty. Especially for those living in shame and sin. Especially for us. And the honor that Jesus gives to her and then the honor that John gives to her, that letting her be an expert witness. The same with Mary Magdalene. Remember Mary Magdalene, who was at least had 7 demons and was rescued from this demonic oppression, and probably was also a prostitute. And John lets her be the first, Jesus lets her be the first witness of the resurrection, and John lets her be that witness in his gospel. If there's a humility in this. Couldn't John have picked someone better to testify of Jesus? Then we have to sit and listen to this Samaritan woman and to Mary Magdalene? This is what it means to be a Christian. I remember how, oh, for heaven's sakes, what is the Syrian army captain who had leprosy's name? I'll think of it in a little bit. Remember how he comes to Elijah, and Elijah says, well, you got to go and wash in the Jordan. He says, I got to wash in that muddy thing? I got better rivers to wash in back home. You got to wash in the muddy river. Jesus brings with him a bunch of forgiven misfits. And he says, you're part of this family too. Amazing. So this Mary Magdalene, despised by the world, loved by Jesus. This Samaritan woman, despised by the world, loved by Jesus. These are our sisters. We'll talk with them, and they'll honor us with their presence in the resurrection. Tell us how it was that day. We're part of the first church in Samaria. We are her members. We delight not only in the glory of our bridegroom Christ, but we rejoice also in the forgiven humility of his bride, the church. God be praised. Sunday Drive Home.